Okay, next up, as you see in front of you, the ancient Hebrews or Israelites, the early history of the Jewish people. At the bottom of the screen, a noted historian who's written an incredible single volume, rather lengthy single volume book on the history of the Jews, says, no people has ever insisted more firmly than the Jews that history has a purpose and humanity a destiny. At a very early stage in their collective existence, they believed they had detected a divine scheme for the human race, of which their own society was to be the pilot. The Jews stand right at the center of the perennial attempt to give human life the dignity of a purpose. So that's strong praise indeed, coming from an historian who's not Jewish by background. But I think there's quite a bit of truth to what's being said here. The Jewish people have been remarkable throughout a long, long stretch of history, going all the way back here to the ancient world, partially because, as I hope we know, they've been faced with enormous persecution throughout almost the entirety of that history, at least off and on, but sometimes in monstrous and gigantic ways, most famously in the Holocaust during World War II. So for this culture and religion and it is both a culture and a religion, it was then, it is now, to have just survived, let alone thrived, is remarkable. And this is a culture that has thrived through all of the adversity that they have faced. So remember, this is one of our pillars of Western civilization. So hopefully through this, if you don't already understand sort of the idea or how and why they're a pillar of Western civilization, this might make it more clear. So hopefully I'll try to answer some of that as we go along. The course of Hebrew or Jewish history we mainly know through the Old Testament. Not that all of the Old Testament is a historical document, verifiable historical document, but a lot of it actually is. It's been compared to other written records from ancient Mesopotamia and other nearby kingdoms, so some of what's in the Old Testament can be verified. Not so much the more miraculous stories themselves, and I'm not weighing in either way whether those miraculous stories happened or didn't happen, but we just don't have historical evidence that they did. That doesn't mean they didn't happen. It just means there's no evidentiary trail. But here you can see kind of the rough outline of Jewish history, and this really covers early Judaism in the left-hand part of it, but it does come up to the modern world with the creation of the state of Israel on the right side in 1948. Of course, we're not going that far in this class, but we're looking at the formative years of Jewish history. How much can we actually know then? Evidence in Hebrew history. Again, the Old Testament certainly is in some ways, to some degree, an historical primary source document, but not in every way. But we have our archaeology. See coins there from Palestine, from the original Jewish homeland. And so there's a lot of sort of written sources, enough even outside the Old Testament, archaeological sources, evidence, and more, that allows us to piece together sort of a pretty decent understanding of the chronology of events, and certainly the worldview, values, beliefs, religious and cultural of this remarkable group. Remarkable, I say repeatedly here, partially because this is a group that, through the many centuries of persecution, has not only survived, as I said, thrived, but succeeded and sort of done well by themselves in sort of all areas of life. Wherever they've gone, the Jewish people have tended to find ways to sort of make it work for them, even under tremendous pressure. As far as their origins are concerned, who were the Hebrews and where did they come from? They appear to have come in part from Mesopotamia. Professor Perry, our lovable author, says the Hebrews, Israelites, or Jews, originated in Mesopotamia and migrated to Canaan, which is basically part of Palestine today. The Hebrew patriarchs, the founders of this culture, this ethnic group, this religion, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, were chieftains of semi-nomadic clans that roamed Palestine and occasionally journeyed to Mesopotamia and Egypt. The early Hebrews absorbed some features of Mesopotamian civilization. So there is some reference to a people that appears to be a reference to the Hebrews in some of the records of Mesopotamian kings, and shows that they were apparently, at least some Hebrews were living in Mesopotamian cities for a time as a somewhat distinct group, ethnic group of their own, or cultural group of their own. So the patriarch Abraham, as talked about in the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, we see here one such passage, chapter 23 of Genesis, which this comes from Paul Johnson, so I'm not quoting Genesis, I'm quoting Paul Johnson talking about Genesis, but how this section describes how Abraham, after the death of his wife Sarah, decided to purchase the cave of Machpelah and the lands which surrounded it as a burying place for her and ultimately for himself. The passage is among the most important in the entire Bible, embodying one of the most ancient and tenaciously held Jewish traditions, evidently very dear and critical to them. It is perhaps the first passage in the Bible also which records an actual event witnessed and described through a long chain of oral recitation, and so preserving authentic details. But it also, this passage is important because this is about land, and kind of putting down roots through land ownership. And this is something we'll come back to in later units, but private property is going to be increasingly emphasized in Western civilization as we go through the centuries. And I think sometimes we have, in my view, a very one-sided view of what private property means. Even though your family, my family, you, me, often own homes and own property, our society tends to be kind of critical of the concept, especially in college. We sort of get pretty critical of private property, as if because we tend to think of private property as about money and profit and kind of greed. All you care about is property. All you care about is sort of getting rich and having more property than somebody else. Well, that's surely sometimes true in some people's case. But keep in mind, when we talk about property and private property, it's not just land, it's not just a home. Anything that you own, any possession of yours, is your property. And those possessions aren't always valuable to you because of their monetary value. They're valuable to you for personal reasons and otherwise. If you didn't have a right to them, and because of a legal system that protected private property, then someone could take your most dear possessions, whether they're economically valuable or psychologically valuable to you. Some heirloom that has great personal value because it belonged to your mother or father or grandparents. So that's property too. And in fact, even a home, we think of it this way today as well, which does surprise me that we can think of that at one and the same time and then think, oh, somebody that's protecting their private property is greedy. I teach U.S. history as well, and when we talk about in those classes the founding fathers, the framers of the Constitution, they were just trying to protect their property. Well, okay, they were, but they were protecting everyone else's property, at least those that owned it. True, not everybody did in those days, but protecting your land where your home is, our homes are our sanctuaries. If we didn't have a legal right to own our home, where else do we really have to go? We could go stay with relatives and have, I guess, somewhat of a sanctuary there. but having a home to come to that you own, which means nobody can legally, sort of violate your rights and your privacy in that home, is something that is not just important. I would say it's essential to human well-being. It's essential to sort of an emotional feeling of connection. A place to call literally home. It's of enormous psychological and social and familial value. So this is sort of the first passage where we see a claim to private property in all of those ways and more. The Hebrew exodus from Egypt has to do, of course, with some of the Hebrews anyway, leaving Palestine, and eventually many of them or all of them winding up in Egypt, being enslaved by the Pharaoh at the time, forced to work in harsh conditions, as slaves often were forced to, and then eventually trying to escape. Professor Perry again says, fearful of remaining permanent slaves of the Pharaoh, the Hebrews yearned for an opportunity to escape. In the early 13th century BC, an extraordinary leader rose among them called Moses. Leading the Hebrews in their exodus from Egypt, Moses transformed them during their wanderings in the wilderness of Sinai Desert, Sinai Peninsula, in between Palestine and Egypt, into a nation welded together and uplifted by a belief in Yahweh, the one God. So this is among other things, sort of a trek and back that eventually brings about a new religion and religious belief, and a move to monotheism, a belief in one God. So this is a key kind of phase in Hebrew history. Moses, of course, being one of the main figures in the Old Testament, and also the one who got the 10 Commandments thrown down by God to him, at least so the legend has it. So this is again a sort of crucial step along the way to the cohering of the religious tradition and cultural tradition that we now know as Judaism. So Moses leads them out of captivity, back to freedom, and they have to fight their way back into Palestine because there were other peoples that laid claim to it. And here here are some bloody passages in the Bible because of it. So they had to conquer, to fight their way back in, sort of as one way to put it. So the conquest of Canaan, as Paul Johnson says, Joshua began and to a great extent completed the conquest of Canaan. Joshua, another legendary figure from the Old Testament. The Canaanites were a higher material civilization than the Israelites, and must have had better weapons as well as strongly built stone cities. There's an air of desperation about the Israelites' conquest, and this helps to explain why they were so ruthless when they took a town. And the Old Testament does, and I might be understating it, sort of catalog a great deal of bloody, and one could even say bloodthirsty battles, whereby the Hebrews sort of took one city in Canaan or Palestine after another to fight their way back into it. So this wasn't done nicely. They weren't asking permission to come back in. This is something quite quite competitive. There were 12 tribes of Israel, and or at least over time, they developed into 12 tribes. You can kind of see the family tree there, at least as told. Now, some of this, I would say, if you look at that family tree on the left, some of that is verifiable history, documented history. Some of it's not so, and some of it could even be, could be non-verifiable history, which we'll never know if it is actual history, or it could be myth. And so there's sort of a connection, intertwining here of myth and reality. the tribes who were related to each other, sometimes literally, certainly by culture, and in time by religion, but they were rather loose-knit politically for a while. So these were kind of like they were pastoralists to some degree, so moving around, at least many of them, but they were organized somewhat like the city-states of Sumeria, which I already talked about in Mesopotamia. Though the city-states, of course, were not nomadic, nonetheless, there were 12 city-states, and they had similar culture, even though they were separate politically, at least at certain times. But what came to be seen here as a necessity was to unify more carefully or more closely. So they decided to elect a king from their midst, so that they could, at least in terms of war and foreign policy, unify and have a better chance of fending off more powerful fish in the region. And by the way, the Israelites were a small group and developed, as we'll see, a small kingdom. So they did have to constantly worry about bigger, larger predatory powers taking them over, which of course is what eventually happens. So Norman Cantor, my go-to guy on antiquity, says the first king, Saul, the first elected king, which means he didn't just make himself king, they picked him out. So this was somewhat democratic. Was given divine sanction for his rule over the people by the ceremony of anointment, wherein the high priest Samuel poured holy oil on Saul's head. Even though Saul came from the smallest of the Hebrew tribes, his anointment won him popularity and loyalty. This became a practice, or becomes a practice, that we'll see over and over again through the centuries in the course of Western civilization. The anointing of a king, putting holy oil sort of on them, which was sort of the official sign that you were the king and ruled with the God's sanction. So he's the first real king, and this is the kind of first time that the Hebrew tribes are united pretty closely together. The next king, David, famed in the Bible for slaying Goliath. And Goliath is treated in the Old Testament as this sort of ogre-like creature, almost a monster-like creature, though the picture here just makes him look like a really big, powerful dude. So there can be the possibility of some myth behind this story of David, the Hebrew king, slaying a much more powerful individual. This is the classic underdog story. The underdog wins. In this case, David, the smaller of the two, see here. But this could be kind of a reference to something, not necessarily even a squaring off of two people, mano a mano, but maybe David leading the Hebrews in battle against a famed, tough, rough and tough king, and winning against the odds. Paul Johnson, again, saying, David became the most successful and popular king Israel ever had, the archetype king and ruler, so that for more than 2,000 years after his death, Jews saw his reign as a golden age. So, and it's during David's reign that the capital city of Jerusalem is created and built for the most part. So this is the golden age of the Hebrew empire, or the golden age of Jewish history in many ways. Next comes the reign of Solomon, and the sort of finishing of the temple at Jerusalem. Solomon was controversial, unlike the two kings we've just looked at. As Norman Cantor says, Solomon generated high glitz court glamour. He ruled with kind of a great deal of kind of drama, lived apparently in splendor, right? All elaborate palaces and stables for hundreds of horses, and this guy kind of lived it up as a king. So much so that he started to generate criticism from members of the Jewish community particularly religious leaders, priests, who believed that the way he kind of flaunted his lifestyle and flaunted his wealth and privilege went against the current the values of their religion and culture. Johnson goes on to say, Solomon was a secular person, a man of his world and age to the bottom of his heart. If he had a heart, because what Solomon became was a Near Eastern monarch of outstanding skill, but his reputation for wisdom is based on a willingness to be ruthless. So Solomon doesn't appear to have been one of the more religious leaders in Jewish history, but he was an effective leader, a skillful one in certain ways, in not so much religious ways, but in kind of political, military functioning. And he was a pretty sharp guy, but could also, and maybe most of the time, wielded a real ruthlessness, which can be beneficial in politics. It can go too far and come back to bite you as well, but ruthlessness up to a point, sadly, can pay. Solomon's many building projects in the end made him unpopular. Why would the building projects make him unpopular? Well, you see it right there. They took money to build those things, and he didn't pay for it himself. He got it from more and more heavily taxing the public. So he lived lavishly, basically on the backs of the work and wealth brought in by the public. And he became so unpopular that when he died, the kingdom was basically an open revolt. So, and split into two, as we'll see. So there was only a unified kingdom for a fairly short amount of time, basically through the reigns of Saul, David, and this guy Solomon. After that, the kingdom broke into two pieces and then declined further from there. So it divided into Judah and Israel. Judah was the smaller area geographically, but it's the one that had the city of Jerusalem. And further north was the kingdom of Israel. So this is still, but in both places, there's now two smaller kingdoms. They've divided. They're independent of each other politically, but they still share lots of cultural characteristics in common, particularly their religious belief, following of the one God, Yahweh, and sort of the origins and early development of Judaism as a religion. After Solomon's death, then, all of the social tensions that were kind of under the surface while he was around burst forth, and it created so much civil conflict that what happened was, again, a splitting into two separate kingdoms, which basically meant they're weaker than ever. Even when those two, the blue and the yellow area there, were united in one kingdom, they were still one of the smaller kingdoms, one of the less powerful ones because of the smaller population size, less resources, etc., fewer resources. But now they're even more vulnerable because they're split into two and not cooperating with each other at that. So the divide and conquer strategy, often used by kings and empires throughout history, the divide part is already done for any conquerors. They just now have to conquer. The Jews have divided themselves, and so they've made themselves more open to invasion. Sure enough, in 722 BC, Israel falls first, Judah in 586, followed by the Babylonian captivity, as it's known. Many Jews were forced out of Jerusalem and out of Palestine and taken to Mesopotamia, Babylon, one of the great cities of Mesopotamia. This is the beginnings, in some ways, of the diaspora, which means the forced spreading of Jews, removal of them from Palestine, and the spreading of them over various parts of the world. The first sort of destination of some Hebrews is Babylon, Mesopotamia. This time, as Perry says, was the darkest moment in the history of the Hebrews. Their state was gone. neighboring peoples had overrun their land, and their holy temple in Jerusalem was in ruins. Basically, it got burned down. Thousands had died in battle, had been executed, or had fled to Egypt and other lands, and thousands more were in exile in Babylon. Again, the Babylonian captivity. So from this point forward, the Hebrew kingdom, or kingdoms, once there was two of them, are no longer totally independent. They last for quite a while longer, but always under the uh, leadership or the dominance of some larger empire. Eventually, it becomes the Romans, the Persians for a time before that. So they're never totally independent. Again, though they do sort of maintain a political, cultural unit in one place in Palestine for centuries after this, until they're finally mostly dispersed in the rest of the diaspora after the Roman period. So diaspora, you see the term here, forced immigration of Jews out of Palestine throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. And Perry goes on to say, in what is a marvel of history, the Hebrews survived as a people. Their faith enabled them to endure exile. And that, I think, we can't know that for sure, but I think it's pretty likely. I don't think that likely that a people who's sort of forced to leave their homeland and spread to as many places as you see in the arrows there, and it actually ended up being much further afield than that. Those are just kind of the initial places that Jews ended up kind of going after the expulsion from Palestine. But how do they keep their own language, their own religion, their own cultural, characteristics, way of life, customs together, when they're sort of in all these different places, and now having to try to fit in and assimilate, if they can even get that far, into one or another different cultures in the Mediterranean world, and later further into the European world. It's not easy to do. Now, in all of these places, eventually, Jews, to one degree or another, do have to assimilate and take on some of the characteristics of the Spanish, if they're in Spain, later, in Poland and Eastern Europe, and all these places you see on the map here. But nonetheless, they still held together a strong kind of core of their earlier religious and cultural traditions, which is true right up until this day. So Yahweh, the one God, Abraham, the patriarch, sort of the first, earthly leader here, and the idea of the covenant with God and the Hebrews as the chosen people as a result. A covenant is like a contract, so it's as if there was a contract between God and his chosen people, the Hebrews. So the chosen people idea we'll see again, because the Christians sort of pick it up with it later on, and it comes up even after that in various times and places in history. And to believe that you're the chosen people of God does say that you're kind of full of yourselves. So that was, I think, certainly true. The Christians guilty of it later on as well. Wait a minute, how do you know you're the chosen people? Well, we just know we are. Nonetheless, the Jews didn't see this as always a benefit. They saw it as a burden much of the time, because since they were God's, the one and only God's chosen people, God expected a great deal out of them. So they sort of felt a pressure extra pressure, more than other people ostensibly felt, to please God, because they were in contract with God. Norman Cantor says in Antiquity, the Jews had no choice but to maintain God's covenant. This was their burden and their glory. The covenant idea is the polar opposite of democracy, multiculturalism, and ethnic equality. It is intensely elitist. So it's true that the idea that we're in a covenant with God as the chosen people and nobody else is a elitist one. They certainly put themselves on a pedestal, but they're not the first or the last people in Western history or world history to think of themselves as kind of the people chosen by God or the gods. The Hebrew scriptures come along in time and written down. There's been a great deal of scholarship over the last 150 years, both about the Old Testament here and the New Testament, which we'll get into later when we get to Christianity, but about sort of who wrote the various books of the Old Testament, later the New, at what times and what places. This is sometimes called textual criticism or biblical criticism. And of course, the religious answer to the question of who wrote it is God. But modern scholars sort of see it as kind of a combination. This is kind of there's different ways to think about this, but the most common formulation is that it's overall the Word of God, but God sort of put ideas in the heads of various people over distances and over time to put down part of the message and then another part. So human beings were kind of, in a sense, taking dictation from God and sort of writing down sort of God's rules and the commandments. So it's, even though it's written by individuals, and historians and scholars have gone back to try to find out who wrote what part of it and when. The book of Isaiah, for instance, it's now believed by most scholars who do biblical criticism study at divinity schools, Christians all, that Isaiah himself, the great Hebrew prophet, didn't actually write all of the book of Isaiah, that he had acolytes, followers, who the claim is that followers after he died, one or more followers who basically agreed with his overall ideas, wrote the second half of the book, or the second chunk of the book of Isaiah. There's even some scholarship that claims that there were 3 generations. So Isaiah, and then his first group of followers, and then another group of followers after that, and together they piece together, it's like kind of part 1, part 2, and part 3 of Isaiah over a long period of time. That's the kind of scholarship that textual criticism has done to try to figure out who wrote what and where and how and when did they all kind of come and get pulled together. That part, I think, is harder. The last part is harder to know, but eventually in time, the 39 books of the Old Testament ended up in the same place, or maybe multiple places at the same time. People had copies. You see there a kind of a scroll copy of this, that, and the other book, and the idea was, what if we sort of bring these together as sort of one book, one volume. And that's, of course, how we know the Bible, both Old Testament and New, today. But it didn't get all composed at once in one place by one person. It was a much kind of messier job than that. That's why it's been a challenge for historians to take this on. The first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah, are often seen as the most important. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those are the ones that have gotten the most attention. And probably right behind them, you see over towards the right, Numbers 23 through 27, are the Hebrew prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, etc. And Christians pick up on those especially as well later on. Remember here, there's a obvious connection, and I'm maybe stating the obvious, but sometimes it's important to do that so we don't lose sight of it. But the connection between Judaism and Christianity is a strong one, and you need look no further to first see that than to recognize that the Christian Bible includes the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, as well. So this was the original Jewish Bible, and it's half of the Christian Bible today. There were actually a few differences in which books were included in the Hebrew Bible and which ones the Christians accepted later on in the Old Testament, but it's other than that, it's the same book. Basic values law, Mosaic law as it's known in the Old Testament. So particularly in the Torah, where the commandments laid out. It's not just 10; there's hundreds of them in the Torah. And here's where I think we can see the pillar idea, that this is this culture, this religion is a huge part of what later becomes the European value system, the value system of Western civilization, at least in part. Ethical monotheism means, right, not only is there one God, monotheistic, God, Yahweh, later, right, Christianity, they pick up the monotheistic ideas, so do the Muslims as well, but ethical monotheism, that God is supremely just and moral, and expects human beings to be moral and just as well. Since in the Old Testament, or in the Torah, first book of the Torah, the book of Genesis, it says in the famous passage, God created man in his own image and then gave him dominion over the birds, the fishes, and everything else. So if man is created in God's image, it means he's not God, he's not that powerful, he's not perfect, but he's pretty good. Then you can see that it would follow that then if God is ethical and moral and expects moral behavior, human beings are kind of expected to deliver because they have part of that ability to think and act morally in them. Not perfectly by any stretch, but it's supposed to be there. The Hebrews, or ancient Jews, also really were the first group we've looked at that starts to think of time in a linear fashion. The Egyptians tended to think of time as sort of cycles that kind of went around and around again. But now we have a concept of history as moving on a timeline from here to here, right, with sort of numbers, the years that we count, and sort of we see time as kind of an extension, sort of in one direction, not as a circle coming back around again, which actually is an extremely influential idea. Right? I mean, our study of history right here and right now is based in part on this, right? This way of looking at time, thinking of time. The Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, the religion shows a strong emphasis on social justice, concern for the downtrodden and the poor. The prophets, like Ezekiel and Isaiah, are kind of in their Jeremiads, which comes from the prophet Jeremiah. A Jeremiad is like a speech or language used to sort of strike fear into the hearts of people, the people you're talking to, by basically tell them, hey, if we don't reform your ways, we're in trouble. In those days, it meant if you don't reform your ways, God's going to come and strike us down with a lightning bolt. So Jeremiah was this kind of shrill warning. We got to clean up our act, or we're in trouble. We're in trouble with God. But one of the things that the prophets admonished the Jewish community for, and particularly their leaders, was for not doing right by the poor. And so you see it throughout the Old Testaments and Torah, more specifically, these sort of directions. Here's what you're supposed to do, you're not supposed to do. So, for instance, it's just one example that comes to mind off the top of my head. If you owned an orchard, say an apple orchard or something, the rule was that if you own the land, any apples that you collect and sort of put in a basket, you pick them off the tree, are yours because you own the land. But any that fall kind of on their own, you come out in the morning and a few have fallen overnight, you're supposed to leave those for the homeless and the poor as they come by and are desperate for food. You're supposed to leave them out so they can take them and have them as a way to sort of help. So there were no government programs in those days for social justice. It was done informally, by society, by the community, by the neighborhood. But nonetheless, it was sort of written into the religious and value system. The Old Testament is both a value system and a religious value system, or the two combined. There was a sense of universalism, which sometimes isn't understood. It's sometimes said that the Jews, and their religion were just sort of about themselves, right? They weren't trying to go out and sell their religion to other peoples, and didn't believe it was sort of important to go and reach out to others. But that's not entirely true. They certainly didn't try to spread the religion as much as we see the Christians do, but there was already some sense of it. And lastly, and this is the part I think that gets us most easily sort of into this idea of a pillar of Western civilization, the concept of individualism. Uh, God creates man in his own image, and human beings are given a great deal of respect from God. I mean, creating God didn't have to create us in His own image. He could have created us as sort of far, lesser creatures. So this is true in many ways. The uh, Hebrew God, uh, according to Jewish lore, and in the documents here, you see it in the Old Testament. God gives Adam the right to name all the animals, everything. And well, why would he do that? Because you don't see that in many other religious traditions. You don't see God sort of having enough trust in human beings to think and to sort of decide to make those kind of decisions. God just does it. But in this religion, at least the value system is, keep in mind, whether we actually believe this stuff to actually be God and come from God is is up to you. I'm here neither to say it's true or not true. I'm here to sort of teach you what it is, at least what the claims were. My opinion, this could be what God was actually doing as God, or not. I think they're both sort of equally possible. So individualism then is then something I think that's also heavily stressed, and it's a big part of the Judaic or Hebrew pillar of Western civilization, because this idea of naming, like, well, who cares? So God allows the Adam to name stuff. Well, naming is an important step to understanding, right? Labeling things. And it requires thinking too. It's not like you just sort of slap a name on everything. First of all, you have to be able to distinguish one thing from another. How do you even know that this is different than that? So that it requires two separate names, unless you're kind of thinking and looking carefully. I mean, some things might be obvious, but others might maybe not so much. So a great deal of thinking has to go in just to know how to name things, and it gets complex really quickly. So God giving Adam the right to, and confident in his ability to name things, and not God doing it, is I think a strong side that in this religion God understood or believed, because He created them, that human beings could use reason like God could, right? That they can sort of think and act ethically, that they have the choice to do so as individuals, right? If also following from the idea of made in the image of God comes the idea that then all human beings kind of have worth. If everyone is created in the image of God, they're not God themselves, but everybody, right? That sort of leads to the idea that all individuals have worth and have value stemming from God. And it also sort of leads to the idea of equality. We're all equal in God's eyes, because we're all created in His image. So ideas like individualism, freedom, equality, all of these things stem, at least in part, from the ancient Hebrews. Freedom to choose, uh, free will. This is something that's actually been debated a lot in Jewish and certainly Christian history, whether there's free will or things are deterministic. And there have been some Christian leaders that have argued the latter, but I think way more often it is the former. that free will is seen as important and true and real. But if you have free will, that means the freedom to kind of act, the freedom to do what you want to, which is again a sign that you can act individually, individualism, right? If you have free will, if there are no other constraints on you, then you can sort of do things as you want to as an individual. But free will also is difficult because you have to then make choices. You have to make the choices yourself. And if you make the wrong choices, it can cause you problems. For instance, in this religion and Christianity, again, as an offshoot in some ways, they are saying that um, that over time, right, uh, the individualistic element in this gives you the ability to either choose to follow God's laws, commandments, and thou shalt not kill, and all the others, or not. You're supposed to, but God's not just sort of saying, yeah, that's going to happen. He's saying you're going to have to make the decision and do the right things to kind of qualify in order to sort of be properly religious. And if you fall short, there are penalties. So, but that's on you. So along with this, then also comes not just individual kind of rights. They weren't thought of as rights yet then, but it's leading in that direction. It's one way it's a pillar, right? You put things on top of pillars. So this is the foundation. But there's also in here the idea that sort of as an individual, you have certain responsibilities as well. You have rights, but you have responsibilities, and you have to make your own choices that are often hard ones. And you have to live kind of with the results of this. So it's here on this slide that we, I think, can see the main ways in which the Hebrew Jewish tradition, going all the way back to the beginnings, sort of put together a great deal of what becomes the value system in the more modern Western world, Western civilization. The United States is an extension of that in many ways. Johnson, I'm reading the same quote earlier again. I think it fits better now, more digestible after what we've just said. No people has ever insisted more firmly than the Jews that history has a purpose and humanity a destiny. At a very early stage in their collective existence, they believed they had detected a divine scheme for the human race, of which their own society was to be the pilot. The Jews stand right at the center of the perennial attempt to give human life the dignity of a purpose. So dignity is a good word here. All human beings have dignity because they're made in God's image. So humanitarianism, which wasn't a thing yet or a word yet, but again, you can see the seeds of that are laid right here as well. And so that becomes a strand of the Western tradition and one of the parts of the pillar. Mosaic law, the legal and moral code both. This is a legal and moral code. There's the 10 Commandments, but hundreds of other such commandments. Most of them, not all, most of them are written in the negative, thou shalt not. But there are some that aren't. As Paul Johnson remarks, there is no distinction between the religious and the secular. All are one. Or between civil, criminal, and moral law. In Mosaic legal theory, all breaches of the law offend God. All crimes are sins, just as all sins are crimes. So to the Jewish religion here, to Judaism, in Judaism, there's no distinction between law and morality. They're supposed to be kind of overlapping each other, kind of completely not a Venn diagram, but they're one and the same. At least that's the theory. Ideally, that's what's supposed to happen, which I think is originally true of a lot of legal systems and religious systems, that they see sort of religious values, moral code, and laws as sort of going together. It doesn't always work that way. It's not always emphasized in the modern world, but it does make sense to think that law should fit with sort of basic morality. If laws are immoral, then there's something wrong with them. The Hebrew prophets, again, come a little bit later in this sort of ancient history. Elijah, Amos, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. And one historian has posited, and I think with a good argument to make here, that the first intellectual revolt in history was by the Hebrew prophets. These guys sort of had revolutionary ideas. So this is the first group of intellectuals that we'll see in this class, anyway, that sort of rise up, kind of against some of the mainstream ideas of the time. So an intellectual revolt means they were coming up with new ideas critical of old ways of doing things. Norman Cantor, again my go-to historian, the prophets did not advocate simply a return to the practices and way of life of earlier times. They were progressives who demanded fulfillment of morality and social justice and the pure worship of Yahweh. To save the nation, it would be necessary to purify national life and reform society. Here's where kind of the Jeremiads come in, where they're making these stark, kind of scary warnings. God will strike us all dead if we don't, stop doing this and that. And so this, of course, was taken extremely seriously. But they believed that, their understanding of things was sort of saving society from, its possible destruction by God Himself.